Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Well, before I start today's topic, just a couple of wider housekeeping notes. One, thank you so much to everybody who has wished us congratulations or Mazal Tov on the birth of our daughter Liana just about 5 weeks ago. I've mentioned it as an aside in some podcasts. Some of my guests have mentioned it, but I don't think I've ever been able to just tell everybody thank you so much for all the showering and ongoing support that everybody has shown us. It's really, really incredible. And, who knows, maybe one day in 15 years, if this podcast is still around, I'll be showing Liana some of these episodes where we talk about how blessed we are to have her in our lives. Also, on the flip side, if you notice in a lot of these podcasts, me being utterly exhausted or wondering why at 10:15 p.m. I am sitting here with a cup of coffee, now you know why. It's been, a huge amount of joy and also exhausting at the same time, and also a lot of hard work, as all things that are worthwhile in life are. The other thing that I wanted to say, just by way of introduction, is in the last couple of months, this podcast has really grown in popularity, and many of my episodes now are getting in the high thousands in terms of number of listens. I love receiving feedback from people. Every single time I publish an episode, I get dozens, sometimes even 100 responses and texts and emails and phone calls with people wanting to talk to me more about the topic. And I absolutely love that. Whether or not you agree with what I'm saying or you disagree, you think that my guest was incredible, you think my guest was terrible, you think what I said was incredible, what my guest, what I said was terrible. I don't care what it is. I would always love to hear your feedback and continue to engage the conversation. And the last podcast, this debate that I had with Luke about general liberalism, focusing on this case study of the Columbia student, was no different. And so many people gave us feedback, and it was really interesting to see what people thought, because I think the feedback that I got really ranged the entire spectrum, from people thinking that Luke was entirely correct to people upset that I didn't go far enough in my position, and really everything in between. In the news since then, I was reading just yesterday, a University of Brown professor has now been deported for ostensibly, quote unquote, anti-Israel activity. And this is now creating a new level in this conversation, as this Columbia student is really just the first of what's probably going to be dozens, if not hundreds, of similar deportations. When we look into this case, this Brown professor had actually attended Hassan Nasrallah, the old head of Hezbollah's, funeral in Lebanon. And so to me, this just, again, very much continues the conversation that I had with Luke. I feel bad almost that Luke is not here to respond to this, but I am hoping to have him back on the podcast soon. But when I think about, the fact that Brown University, yes, a private school, but one that, of course, gets public funding, is having a teacher who is going to a terrorist leader's funeral, right? That is the type of person that we want deported, right? Obviously, if this person was a citizen, they have every single right, yes, go to whoever's funeral you want, no matter how odious it is. But if our taxpayer money is going to pay for green cards and going to actually allow people to come in here as work permits, I think they actually do have to hold to a higher standard. And one of those higher standards that I would want to see is actually buying into this wider framework of liberalism and everything that we value in the West. But again, if you are tired of me talking about the subject, go see the last podcast. It was really incredible. I obviously have a ton of respect for Luke. And it was funny because as I was re-listening to that podcast between me and Luke, I found myself half agreeing with Luke and half agreeing with myself throughout the podcast. So I am still torn on this wider question. But again, you can see that podcast. Just, back on this, still on this topic of this last podcast, I got a lot of very interesting responses. A lot of it was, I sort of was able to easily predict who would say that they liked, Luke's side and who would say they liked my side better. But there were actually three people that I wanted to highlight. I'm not going to give their names because all three of them wrote to me saying, please don't quote me on this. One of them was a political science professor at a local university who listened to the podcast and said that they basically fully agreed with me, but they would be too afraid to ever say anything about it for fear of retribution by coworkers. Now, this is odd because this professor had tenure. And so, even when you think about professors that have tenure, which is essentially your job is protected no matter what you say, who essentially study this topic of political science, too afraid to express their actual opinions on contemporary political questions, that to me is something that is very sad and potentially even dangerous, because then different fields such as the social sciences, I know I've talked about the humanities before, but now I'll talk about political science. It gives this aura that, all political scientists think X, Y, or Z. And that's obviously not the case. It's just the ones who disagree feel too afraid to speak out. The second one was somebody who is an immigration lawyer who also wrote to me. When in the discussion with Luke, we didn't focus too much on the legal aspect. We mostly focused on the philosophic aspect, but I tried to, talk a little bit about what I was reading about the legal aspect. And she essentially wrote to me and said that she agrees that legally the Trump administration was well in their right to deport the student, but again, that she would never be able to say so publicly because she still works in some capacity as an immigration lawyer, which is obviously a very progressive field. And so she would never, be willing to say such publicly. The last, and this is, one of the more interesting conversations I had, I was at coffee with another political science professor at a local university. And, just like I often do when I talk to, really anybody, but specifically academics, is I ask them, hey, what have you been thinking about lately? What have you been writing about? What's your research about? Just a separate side tip for anybody right now who is in a undergrad or grad school program. If you ever want to get on the good side of a professor, just ask them what their research is lately, because probably nobody has almost ever asked them that, specifically not a student. And so most people love the chance to, oh, here's what I'm researching, here's what I'm writing. That is the side tip. But the main point was I asked them, hey, what have you been thinking about lately? And they looked at me and they said, it's been a very weird last couple of weeks because I've been reanalyzing, what if everything that I have thought about politics for my entire life, both personally and academically, is wrong? And I said, what do you mean by that? And they said, my whole life I was so sure about, A, B, C, and D, but in the last couple of months, a lot of those things have been challenged. And, I can give more specific examples, but I think just the general framework of, I think, a shift of what's happening is, and this is something that, of course, I've talked about on the podcast before, that many academic fields were sort of becoming increasingly narrow. And this is true both for academic fields. This is also true for the sort of media world. This is also true in terms of the tech world. And what we've seen for whatever reason in the last year, is it because of sort of this, post-COVID world that everybody is now getting out of? Is this because of, the rise of Trump 2.0, right? It's very unclear. And I'm interested to see the historical analyses in, 10, 20, 30, maybe even 100 years. But there's been sort of this cultural shift where a couple of years ago, the culturally correct thing to do was to sort of hop on the progressive bandwagon wherever that took you. So if that takes you to Black Lives Matter, if that takes you to just a full uncritical acceptance of all the most ludicrous, far-fetched claims that the trans activist community makes. Again, that has nothing to do with treating trans individuals with respect. You can see Lauren and I's discussion about that. But there was this progressive bandwagon that everybody was just hopping onto more and more. And from my perspective, that reached its pinnacle both with COVID, when during this whole absurd debate about the origins of the lab versus the wet market, and then obviously this wider debate about school closures and everything there. And then, of course, on October 7th, when it seemed like becoming a progressive meant de facto supporting Hamas, that was sort of the apex of insanity. And now I think we do have a lot of people fully reanalyzing a lot of their dominant beliefs. Again, my entire life has been one set of me analyzing and reanalyzing everything I ever believed, but it's been very interesting to watch other people. And again, this can be true whether or not people were very far on the left or now we're coming back to the center. Maybe they were very far to the right and they're coming back to the center. Maybe they were very far, to the right and now they're going even further right, and the left even further left. But this is a really interesting time to hear out people's ideas, which again is why it is all the more important to talk to people that you disagree with, which gets me into the topic today. Today, I'm going to do a solo podcast. I had promised one of my listeners who had said that their favorite episodes were the solo podcast episodes, that I'm going to do at least a monthly solo podcast. If anybody has any ideas or topics or questions that they want me to cover, feel free to either email me or to leave a comment on one of these podcasts. But today I want to talk about, a story that for me sadly represents one offshoot of the past year and a half. Obviously not the most important one. It is not nearly as important as what's been going on in Israel. It's not nearly as important as the rampant anti-Semitism that's been happening all throughout the Western world, where Hamas supporters, march unadulterated through the streets. But today I want to talk about a podcast episode that I had planned in many different iterations over the last year and a half that simply never happened. Just to give some background, everybody who knows me, that I love talking to people who I disagree with. Some of my favorite episodes on this podcast have been when I have discussed or even debated ideas with people, because for me, as somebody who thinks about the world, the best way for me to actually understand if what my gut reaction to something is makes sense is to test it out by talking to other people. And oftentimes I say, oh, that prior idea of mine was pretty stupid. Or I say, this hunch that I had was actually pretty smart. That is, again, how basic ideas of capital L liberalism are working, right? The best ideas sort of rise to the top, and there's sort of this Darwinian survival of the fittest with ideas. But needless to say, that's how I've always thought about the world, right? The vast majority of my friendships are based on, again, not arguing, but, in Hebrew, we would say a machloket, right? Or, a debate for a higher purpose, right? Not just a debate to say, I want to argue because I'm annoying, but like to really, for me, if I respect somebody, it means hearing what they have to say and also pushing back if I'm like, that doesn't fully check out. So anyway, since October 7th, since much of the pro-Palestinian world shifted from what I think was a principled, even if I disagreed, criticism of the occupation. I'm talking about the West Bank and or Gaza, and pushing a two-state solution. Again, depending on my mood pre-October 7th, I was either on board with the two-state solution or against the two-state solution. But again, much of the Western anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian world criticized the occupation, aka West Bank / Gaza, and they wanted to go to a two-state solution. October 7th, either one of two things happened, or probably a mixture of both. One, either the masks were pulled off and you realized, most of these activists never actually wanted a two-state solution. They really wanted the entirety of Israel destroyed. The two-state solution was just, one train stop on that, final journey to having Israel destroyed. But now that October 7th happened, and you just see this sheer glee and joy out of so many different disciplines coming, the mask came off, or something shifted after October 7th, unclear exactly what, but I wanted to explore this shift. I wanted to really understand how, somebody in the West can ostensibly support Hamas. So I started looking for somebody to engage in a debate / conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I tried so hard. I talked to dozens of different people who I knew were involved, some of them in LGBT circles, others in very lefty academic circles, others in the Islamic community. And I said, hey, connect me to somebody who you think is, well-spoken, smart, knows their history, right? I have no desire to, beat up on some, poor 17 or 18-year-old that, can't tell me what, who Herzl was or what the Balfour Declaration was. But I wanted somebody who was, genuinely knowledgeable and genuinely able to engage, and us not have to relitigate the entire history of, what happened in 48, what happened in 67, but to come in with me saying, hey, these things are really complicated, but right now, right, 2025, what do we do? How can the two communities, the Jewish / pro-Israel community and the Islamic / pro-Palestinian community, like how can we actually make something work out? Because, I don't think either of those communities are, all of a sudden dissipating or going to disappear anytime soon. So something eventually has to be solved through some sort of dialogue, right? So I tried talking to, dozens of different people, and I kept getting shut down. I kept, having different people pull me along for some of it. A lot of people, understandably so, wanted to, have a preliminary phone call or Zoom call that was going to be unrecorded. A lot of them were very concerned that they didn't know what questions I was going to ask, even though I told them, hey, the style of my podcast is I almost never pre-write questions when I talk to people. It's just sort of, whatever pops into my mind, and I said, hey, all topics are on, but, I'm always very gracious with guests. I always tell them, if you want me to cancel the episode or you want me to cut something out, I'm always happy to, whatever. I gave every, piece of defensive padding I could. And every single one of them fell through because at the last minute, one of them said, well, I don't want to engage in, normalization with Zionists. So, okay, fine, whatever. Another person said, I'm not really sure this is the best use of my time. Another one was a little bit less, genuine. And, they wanted to say, well, I just want to know if I'm going to talk to you as a representative of the Jewish community, I want to make sure that you condemn the genocide happening in Gaza. And I told them, and I said, it's funny you bring that up because one of the big debates that I wanted to have is why I don't think this is a genocide. And they said, well, I would never talk to somebody like you then. Over and over again, I tried having this podcast set up. This popped into mind recently because I was following a lead of somebody else who is a lecturer at a university in Los Angeles that I was potentially going to talk to, and that just fell through. So I was just very frustrated thinking about this. And I think, in a lot of ways, it connects back to the last conversation I was having about freedom of speech. And I think, there's a couple big reasons why this really frustrates me. One, again, I just think open conversation is the most important thing we have in our toolbox. Again, for most of history, disputes were solved with violence. It's only in the last couple of hundred years, or some might argue actually in the Talmud, 1600 years ago, that people have this crazy idea of, hey, if we disagree about, I don't know, God or politics or philosophy, instead of, seeing who has the best swordsmanship, we can actually just sit in a room or a coffee house or a study hall or in 2025, a podcast and actually duke it out. That's a pretty radical idea. And almost all signs are painting towards that actually becoming less true, right? It seems like there's more of an impetus to resort to violence now in 2025 than there might have been 25, 30 years ago, especially around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this idea of open conversation is just so important if we want the safety of really everybody to be in mind, right? If we want the safety of not just Palestinians and Israelis, but even of Jews in America, of the pro-Palestinian community in America, right? We don't want to be in a situation where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being litigated in the streets of places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, because violence will get worse between these two communities. And so why not have one of these conversations? The second, and this is something that really grinds my gears even more. Many of the people that I was talking with were either social activists or academics, right? The social activist, fine, right? I totally understand if your identity is a social activist, you might not want to have a public debate about the entire thing that you're socially activisting for, right? So sure, I get why, let's say I wanted to have an interesting debate about, I don't know, abortion. I understand why somebody who's a pro-choice or a pro-life activist wouldn't want to engage in a debate, should one be pro-life or should one be pro-choice? Because that really calls into question, their whole project. So, okay, fine. Even if I don't understand it, it's why I've never really identified as an activist, because I think being an activist means by definition shutting off some critical part of your brain. But, I'm sure many people might be upset by that statement. Just a stereotype, not true for everyone. But fine, the activists, fine, whatever, they can do whatever they want. But many of these people were academics. Many of these people were actually professors, some of them actually tenured professors, right? Meaning there's almost nothing they can say that would make them lose their job in this debate. But still, they didn't want to engage because they didn't want to either platform my ideas or, and the thing that I, really think, and this will get me to the last point, I think a lot of them wouldn't actually be able to defend their position. Again, I think for a lot of people, and this is especially true in the academic community, this is just one of those things you had to say. Just like you had to tweet Black Lives Matter in 2020, you just have to tweet Free Palestine in, 2024 or 2023 after October 7th, now up until 2025. And so the real reason why I think this podcast never happened is because I really do think the essential two camps, and again, I tend not to think in binaries, and I think there is every position on the in the middle ground between staunch pro-Israel and staunch pro-Palestinian. But the vast majority of people you meet in the world today that are quote unquote pro-Palestinian, I simply think lack fundamental knowledge about what's going on. I think they don't understand history. I think, there's a couple of very popular books of Palestinian history that just completely skews the entire history of what happened in the last 20 years with all sorts of wacky revisionism mixed with some strange academic, post-colonial, post-modern, mumbo jumbo that makes no sense. And I think, it's fundamentally undebatable, right? A lot of times when you take in these ideas and you have, all these neo-Marxist-y, postmodern theories as to why Israel is this terrible colonial entity. But if you're actually talking to a real person the way that real people think, and I were to push back, I actually don't think a lot of those people would ever be able to hold up in any sort of conversation. The second, and I think, equally important, many of these people don't understand Judaism. So some of the people that I was actually in touch with were notable Jewish anti-Zionists. And, I wanted to engage with some of them because, again, for me, and I've spoken many times about Zionism before, Zionism is almost a paradox within the Jewish community, right? Zionism is simultaneously a continuous movement of Jewish longing for the land, and Zionism is a new movement of political nationalism that at least in its origins, is almost antithetical to the religious components of Judaism. If that's confusing, go see my 4-part series on Zionism. But anyway, I thought it would be really interesting to talk to, Jewish thinkers about this who are staunchly anti-Zionist. I'm not talking about Jews who are more critical about Israel than me. I'm talking about Jews who are fundamentally, Zionism is white supremacy, neo-Nazi colonialism. And again, I think for those people, many of them just don't understand Judaism. Again, the vast majority of them have almost no Jewish education. There's actually a disproportionate number of people who have converted into non-Orthodox strains of Judaism who are disproportionately represented in anti-Israel activist space. Now, of course, this does not mean anybody should treat people who genuinely convert, regardless of whether or not it's Orthodox, Reform, or Conservative, any differently. But a lot of people, a lot of the people that I've met, and again, this could just be a stereotype, but again, it does fit a lot of anecdotes to the point where it's almost becoming more of a heuristic, is somebody who felt that, the liberal Jewish community, when I say liberal here, I mean, socially liberal Jewish community is just more accepting than perhaps their, Christian background, and so converted to Judaism a couple years ago and might be, LGBTQ or something, and then all of a sudden they realize that, well, as a progressive, now everybody has to be radically anti-Israel. So people who had converted to Judaism 2 years ago, and all of a sudden they're the face of, anti-Israel movements, spanning for groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, that's barely Jewish anyway. And all of a sudden, well, it gives them credibility because they found their token Jew who, converted to Judaism, 2 years ago that knows less than, a kindergartner in the Orthodox community. But anyway, these are many of the people who, side note to this debate. The last reason is I just think a lot of these people's moral framework is off, right? And I just think they're easily misled. Again, we're in sort of a weird situation right now where we have, I'm going to try to coin a new term. Who knows if it's going to take off? The social media-ification of warfare. In other words, war has always been bloody. War has always been terrible, right? But just we never had the entire world having iPhones and access to social media to immediately upload it. All of a sudden, with this war in Gaza, kids are dying in Gaza, which is terrible, and that's bad. But it doesn't mean it's genocide, right? Sometimes there is collateral damage in war, and to understand the ethics of the war, you don't focus on the civilian collateral damage. You have to zoom way out and ask yourself foundational questions. What is this war about? Is this just? What are the points of view of both sides? How are both sides attempting to minimize collateral damage, right? You can't just show somebody a picture of a 4-year-old who had been blown up by a bomb and say, see, this is why the other side is terrible. That makes no moral sense. But it's exactly the type of moral reasoning that many people who spend all day on their smartphone just, being addicted to those dopamine hits of finding that next video or that next thing to slightly piss them off, or that next, social activist cause, because many of these people have very little lives in and of themselves. It's the exact thing that can catch their eye, and they can say, of course, this is terrible. Again, it doesn't help that Jews, the most hated people in history, the people who've had the most amount of conspiracy theories against them in history, that are caught at the center of this, that obviously just adds fuel to this wider dumpster fire. But anyway, needless to say, this is why I think that many of these podcasts never happened. One comment I had that's just stuck in my mind. This is actually with an Israeli history professor, a local one. I won't give the name. And I was in touch with her before October 7th, and I noticed her posts getting increasingly unhingedly anti-Israel. She was always critical of Israel, but she was never what I would call insane. She was just somebody that I disagreed with. After October 7th, I do think that she became insane, for lack of a better word. And so she was one of the people that I reached out to, and I said, hey, I would love to have this conversation / debate with you, or if you know anybody, I know you're very active in a lot of these anti-Israel communities. And she said, I don't think it would be morally right for myself or anyone else in the community to talk with you. And I, was pushing a little bit, and I said, well, I do think, talking ideas out is sort of the best way to, figure out who's right and who's wrong, and, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And she said to me, this is on a phone call, if you were a Jew in the 1940s, would you go into a debate about whether or not Hitler is right? Or better yet, she continued, would you invite a Nazi onto your podcast? Now, I want to take a couple of steps back. I know a lot of people are probably shocked by that. Obviously, in my mind, the equation of Zionists with Nazis is, of course, anti-Semitic, of course, false, of course, just represents all the lunacy of what's happening on the left. But let's take that comment at face value, because I want to actually think about this from a hyper-rational perspective. Let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that you believe Zionism is Nazism, right? So let's figure out what's going on, right? Right now we are in America, right? Many of you listening to this, some of you are probably in Europe or Israel, but most of my listeners are from North America. So right now, the vast majority of institutions, political institutions and military institutions in America are de facto pro-Israel. Sometimes they're, of course, not as pro-Israel as we would want, but America is, of course, sending, military aid to Israel under both Democrat and Republican presidents. They're sending weaponry to Israel. The vast majority of universities have partnerships with Israel. So if I'm sitting here and I think that Israel is quite literally Nazi Germany, and I'm seeing our de facto entire institutional life funding this, quote unquote Nazi project, and I had the opportunity to hop onto a podcast to debate, to potentially convince, I don't know, 1,000 people or 500 people, however many it is, to be convinced that Zionism is terrible, I would, of course, take that up. And what I said back to this professor is, hey, if I was around during Nazi Germany, it doesn't matter where I was, and somebody who was supporting Hitler, like, let's say I was on a podcast, whatever the equivalent of podcast was in Germany in the 1930s, and a Nazi invited me onto their podcast, me as a Jew, I'm for sure saying yes. Because if I have even a tiny chance of convincing somebody who can be influential that Hitler and Nazism is bad, I would, of course, take that. I would actually consider that morally insane to say no. Because, again, the Nazis had all the power in the late 1930s and 40s, just like, in some sense, at least in America, general support for Israel has almost all the institutional power. So, yes, of course I would engage with a Nazi in the 1930s. Now, I might not do it now, right? If a neo-Nazi invited me onto their podcast in the year 2025 and wanted to relitigate, was Hitler right or anything like that, that I would say no, because again, the neo-Nazis have very little institutional power. So why would I, give this person the tiny amount of legitimacy by, me going on their podcast and them saying, hey, I had this debate with a, rabbi and Jewish professor, blah, blah, blah. But if they had power, I for sure would. And this is why I think that this actually belies the entire conviction and strength of the pro-Palestinian argument. Because from their point of view, I actually don't think they fully believe in their conviction within the world of logic and ration. I do think a lot of the pro-Palestinian community is split between people that have religious presuppositions. I'm talking about Islamists who just abhor the idea that any former Islamic land is no longer in Muslim control. And many of these people understand that if they were to try to litigate this in the public sphere, right, you can't retort to, what the hadiths say in order to convince a wider Western audience. And then the other half are people that are existing so far in this strain of post-colonialism, postmodernism, that they understand that their ideas are just going to be indecipherable to the vast majority of people. And so many of these people come up with these vague reasons as to why they can't engage. But this made me think, the whole idea of anti-normalization, of, anti-Zionists not engaging with Zionists, again, from their perspective, if you really believe that all the institutions in America are controlled by people who love Israel, and you're convinced, let's take even with a more radical claim, you're convinced, as Ilhan Omar tweeted a couple, years ago, that Zionists have hypnotized the world in some sense, and you have the chance to debate one. If you think your side makes sense, of course you should take up that debate. So again, the podcast never happened. I'm very sad about that. I will say that if anybody here does know anybody, or if anyone that's listening to this somehow is radically anti-Israel and still continues to listen to this podcast, one, please continue listening. I really appreciate that you are still here, but let me know. I would love to be connected to anybody. You can feel free. My email is dlevine21@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on any of my postings on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or any other podcast apps. But in many ways, this one case study of me just trying to find somebody to have a conversation. And again, everybody who listens to my podcast, my style. My style is not, coming at you, clawing at your throat. I want to understand ideas and I want to steelman the best ideas of the other side. So I don't even want to debate somebody to say, I don't want of these videos, rabbi owns idiot, blah, blah, blah. Those things, as cathartic as they might be, right? That's not where real ideas are fomented with these, viral videos that both sides can easily produce. But everybody knows that I genuinely just want to hear out different opinions. So if anybody is connected or does know anybody, please let me know. Until then, thank you so much for all the support on this podcast. Again, please like, comment, subscribe, send this to your best friend, your cousin, your grandparents, anybody else who you're thinking about, and have a wonderful rest of your day.